A long time ago, I used to have this awkward habit at parties and social gatherings at my friends' houses of sidling over to a bookshelf and spending more time with a book or two over the evening than talking and mingling with people. I have, since those days, abandoned most of my antisocial tendencies, but I do love browsing people's bookshelves as much as I love browsing the bookshelves of a bookstore. You never know what you can find, and I've discovered some fantastic treasures in doing this, and I kind of miss that now that I am much more polite. One such discovery happened many years ago when a friend of mine said, "Hey, you read comics? Have you read anything by Jacques Tardi?" And I hadn't even heard of him. In fact, I misheard the first time he said it, and I thought he meant the filmmaker Tati, and I didn't know that Tati had made comics. But he said, "No, you have to read Jacques Tardi," and he went to his shelves and he picked out this book, The Bloody Streets of Paris. It was a black and white European comic. As soon as I looked at it, I was reminded of Hergé and Linclair. I sat down and read this book in one go at that point of time. Absolutely loved it, borrowed it, brought it back home, and read it a couple more times over the next couple of months. This was a noir detective story set in 1950 in France, just after the war has ended, and the lead protagonist, Nestor Burma, was a private investigator who had been a soldier in the war, and I found this a fascinating comic, primarily for its atmosphere. Drenched in this post-war gloom, it depicted a seedy underbelly of Paris in which people were scrambling to put pieces of their lives back together. The art style fulfilled the first impression I had with very Hergé-like realistic backgrounds and architectural detail, but a slightly cartoony look to the characters, which created an instant recognition of something familiar, but also I found that a very interesting style for what was a gritty, urban, and adult story. The portrayal of the characters were almost classic noir. They were very iconic or laconic. They weren't necessarily three-dimensional, but the way that they played off of each other and the way that the plot twisted around them was extremely pleasurable for a fan of detective fiction or fan of noir fiction. There are plenty of things that I recognized and appreciated nods and homages to, particularly American films. But at the same time, there was something very unique in the flavor of this story. It was quite gritty and grimy. The violence was sudden and ferocious. The morality of the characters were very murky at best. And yet there was this driving force that kept the reader engaged in something that was both tight as well as loose. And that's really what hooked me first about Tardi. He has a very unique combination of grit and darkness and realism, sometimes pitch black comedy, but with emphasis on the pitch blackness, but it is married to this loose, cartoony style, which lends itself very interestingly to this other part of his storytelling, the dark part. The Bloody Streets of Paris ended up being a terrific introduction to the works of this French master, and every single book of his that I've read so far has contained to some degree or the other that same balance, the combination of dark, sometimes horrific subject matter to architectural perfection and design of background artwork and loose, wobbly lines depicting the players and the stages for these stories. The Bloody Streets of Paris ended up being one of my favorite reads of that year and has continued to be one of my favorite comics. It is definitely one of the most wonderful introductions I've had to a creator, and I went on a hunt immediately after reading that to see what other Jacques Tardi I could find. I saw that there were a huge number of books in French, but in English, which is the only way I could read them, there were only a handful of books published by NBM that seemed to be out of stock and very expensive whenever a copy or two could be found. I did, however, see that Fantagraphics had recently published two of Jacques Tardi's works and were looking to publish more, and that got me excited. In today's episode of For the Love of Comics, we're going to take a quick survey of all of the books that I've been able to get my hands on, which will, I think, impress upon everybody just what an incredibly versatile writer-artist Tardi is. The books in front of me over here are unified by a singular talent and vision and a particular unique style that is very recognizable, but they span all kinds of genres. There are hard-boiled noir violent crime stories like West Coast Blues, like a sniper lining up his shot, or Run Like Crazy, Run Like Hell. There are surrealistic and satirical stories like You Are There There or the fantasy comics Adele Blanc Sec. His harrowing accounts of the First World War, it was the War of the Trenches and Godamn This War, as well as the epic family biography of his father as a prisoner of war in World War II. There's also a sci-fi steampunk tale and more adventures of Nestor Burma. I'm going to go through these books chronologically as published by Fantagraphics because when waiting for them 2 books a year, that's the way I read them. But towards the end of the video, I'll also rearrange them in chronological order the way they appeared originally in France. Of course, a number of Tardi comics still remain to be translated and published in English. So at the end of the video, I'll also talk a little bit about my hopes for the continuation of this library. But right now, let's jump into this quick book-by-book look at the Jacques Tardi collection from Fantagraphics. The Bloody Streets of Paris edition that I read wasn't Fantagraphics. This was brought out by iBooks in 2003. And iBooks brought it out as a European size and format album. This was paperback. This copy that I picked up for myself ended up being a hardcover, but it's been homebound, which I kind of like. And as I said, this introduced me to a number of Tardi's trademarks, including lettering, where it's not just the shouting or loud volume speech, but also the proper nouns, the names of places and people that are in all caps, with the rest of the text being in sentence case. Although this is the oldest of these books, I did pick this up many years later. I finally got my hands on a copy after having picked up a number of these other books. But the first books to be published by Fantagraphics were West Coast Blues and You Are There. You Are There was the first Tardi book that Fantagraphics brought out in 2009, but it had originally been published in French in 1979, 30 years earlier by Casterman. This is a very interesting and experimental work. It's an early Tardi work from 1979, as I said, and it's interesting that Fantagraphics chose this to be the first of his books that they would publish in their new series. And that's because Fantagraphics isn't taking a chronological approach to these books. You don't actually need a chronological approach. They're all, with one exception, separate individual pieces based often on adaptations of novels. But Fantagraphics didn't publish and isn't publishing them chronologically. So the fact that they started with a surreal satire, one of Tardi's lengthiest works, but also a little obtuse. I had trouble coming to grips with the story, although of course the artwork and the presentation of it is terrific, and it has some incredible sequences of hallucinations or surreal visual imagery that works incredibly well. But on the whole, the story for me wasn't as engaging, but it was a terrific showcase of the talents and of course the range, because I had read Tardi's noir detective fiction, and the fact that it was the same art style and approach but such a different story I found very interesting. Although the first to be published by Fantagraphics, this wasn't the first book I read. That was actually West Coast Blues. West Coast Blues, also published with You Are There in 2009 by Fantagraphics, was originally published by Humanoids in 2005. So it's a much more recent work of Tardi's, unlike the 1979 You Are There. And this for me seemed much more in line with the Nestor Burma story that I had read. This is a pitch black, very violent noir story with a perhaps familiar trope of an everyday normal man who gets caught up in things far beyond his understanding, and then violence erupts around him. So wrong place, wrong time, and the consequences of that. But the suddenness and the casualness of the violence, as well as the darkness of the story, felt to me like a perfect use of Tardi's talents. The next year, 2010, saw Fantagraphics bring out It Was the War of the Trenches, and if you're looking for a masterpiece by Jacques Tardi, go no further. This is perhaps one of the greatest war, or I should say anti-war stories ever written. It is a searing document of a bunch of soldiers, and the whole story, the whole book is stories of these soldiers. Some of these stories are short, a couple of pages, some of them are longer, and each one of them is absolutely devastating. There is a frankness in this storytelling where Tardi does not shy away from any of the horrors, and the barrage of suffering and pain that these stories have gradually build up within you. And I think this is a very tough read in some ways, but it's not as tough as it would have been in other people's hands. I think Tardi makes it accessible using his style, using his lines, but also shows an incredible amount of range in varying that style. You can see it, it's still recognizable, but as the stories progress, for example, after the initial pages, he settles into this 3 long panels a page, a style that he sticks to not only in this book, but in some others that we'll see. But It Was the War of the Trenches remains one of the most haunting stories of war. This is the First World War, and it's based in part at least on notes that his grandfather took and his grandfather's experiences. A number of these soldiers are people that his grandfather served with. And the tragedy of the war is personalized over here to an extent that I've rarely seen it. And the way that you see it in the best anti-war fiction is where it makes you look at the human cost at an individual level rather than spending time with countries and politics and large military maneuvers. This book is singularly focused on individual people, their experiences, and when you get to the end of their story, just when you're done absorbing it, you start on the next one. The same year as Fantagraphics brought out It Was the War of the Trenches, they also brought out the first volume of The Extraordinary Adventures of Adele Blanc Sec. This collected the first 2 Adele Blanc Sec stories that Tardi had originally published in French all the way back in 1976. And this is something very different from It Was the War of the Trenches. This is a color comic by Jacques Tardi that is absolutely madcap. It is perhaps a parody of certain kinds of 1940s, 1950s serial adventures, I think in movies or in pulp books. They feature a very dour but capable heroine, the titular Adele Blanc Sec, and involve all kinds of things like dinosaurs and a pterodactyl terrorizing Paris, mummies and golems. And this series of comics is quite a delight to look at visually. The first couple of stories, the ones collected in volume 1, aren't the most coherent of them. At times the twisting, turning, double crosses, disguises can be a bit much. But it's a great start to a series that improves in its next stories, and another fine example of Jacques Tardi's range, this time in a sort of nonsensical fantasy steampunk adventure. 2011 actually saw 3 books from Jacques Tardi being brought out by Fantagraphics in their hardcovers, including volume 2 of Adele Blanc Sec, collecting The Mad Scientist and Mummies on Parade, stories that Jacques Tardi had originally done in 1977 and 1978. And as I mentioned, this is a jump up from the first 2 stories. As far as the narrative is concerned, these stories are still delightfully drawn and designed. There's a lot of pure nonsense in the mad scientist's motivations and what people want to do and why they are doing things. But I think these 2 stories are much easier to follow and the art actually improves. You can see Tardi's style evolve and assert itself differently. Since I know there are many more Adele Blanc stories left, I'm looking forward to them improving like these 2 did over the first 2 with subsequent volumes. The second book Fantagraphics brought out in 2011 was The Arctic Marauder, which was originally published in French in 1974 by Godamn. So this is another earlier piece, and like the Adele Blanc Sec stories, we can see Tardi embrace steampunk, a little bit more fantasy storytelling, different from his crime or his war stories. And this might be one of the Tardi books that I am the most torn about, because in some ways it contains some of his most breathtaking art. The style, while being recognizable, is very unique. There's this gray shading pencil feel to it, although I don't think there are actual pencils on this. Certain pages are inky and almost wood blocky. The architecture and particularly the machinery is just superbly rendered, but the narrative, the plot and the rest of the story, apart from the art, is really a little, again, it's a little muddled. It's not very entertaining to read, even though there's no way this Jules Verne, steampunkish, exploration-oriented book shouldn't be fun. It's just it's just not that interesting outside of the art, in spite of the kind of expectations you would have of something like that. But they're still worthwhile, particularly for showing you the kind of diversity that Tardi is able to bring to his storytelling. And the third Tardi book that Fantagraphics brought out in 2011 is one I have no reservations about. Like a Sniper Lining Up His Shot was also one of the most recent works that Fantagraphics published. They published this in 2011. It was originally published just the year before in 2010 by Futuropolis. And this is another adaptation, like West Coast Blues, of a novel by Manchette. And once again, Tardi delivers a hyper-violent noir. This tells the story of a hitman, contract killer, mercenary who has decided to retire but finds himself in the middle of a whole bunch of different things that have to do with his decision, including his old employers and people out for revenge. This story kicks in almost immediately and is relentless. The singular purpose of these characters to kill or to survive, the weaponry and violence used, all of these things hit you like machine gun fire. Another bleak masterpiece. In 2012, Fantagraphics published just one book, New York Mon Amour, a collection of 4 stories done by Jacques Tardi, all of which had been previously published in different years, and included one story which he wrote himself, and the other 3 were adaptations of works by Benjamin Legrand and Dominique Grange. This collection is a great sampler of Tardi's shorter and bizarrer stuff. The first story, The Cockroach Killer, was originally published in Raw issue 1, and I think created a bit of a sensation for many people. This was their introduction to Jacques Tardi in the United States, and it's a very strange but oddly compelling story. You're not quite sure what is a hallucination and what is not. The cockroach exterminator has a past that is haunting him, but he's also caught up in a couple of different things over here that pretty much fracture his psyche. This story uses a very interesting variation on Tardi's style, including selective colors. Cockroach Killer is the longest story here, takes up the majority of this volume, but then there are 3 other short stories, so you could look at this as 1 novel and 3 stories. This collection is particularly interesting because none of these stories really resemble each other. They do have a certain psychological frailty at their center, but the way the plots unfold and the characters in them are very unique. Not everyone will love all of the stories in this, but all 4 of these stories are set in New York. That's why it's called New York Mon Amour. And it's fascinating to see the sort of seedy underbelly view that Tardi has brought to Paris and other places in France, bringing that to New York. Even though this is an American city, it feels like a very European take on it, sort of the way the movie Leon, the Professional, showed New York, but with a very distinct French view of it. And the 4 of these stories together show you how good Tardi is at evoking a place. The next year, 2013, saw Fantagraphics bring out Godamn This War, originally published in 2008 by Casterman. This book sees Jacques Tardi returning to the First World War that he had explored in It Was the War of the Trenches, and just like that book, this book is devastating. Done in color instead of his usual black and white, once again dominated very often by 3 panels stretching across a page. As we go deeper and deeper into this story of soldiers in the First World War, as each chapter dedicated to 1 year of that war, as each chapter stretches on, the color starts being leached and desaturated from the page. Things get grayer and colder and bleaker until we forget that we were reading a color comic, until we look at things like this that are very stark and very violent. But the rest of it starts feeling almost like a black and white comic. And that's just one of the techniques that Tardi uses once again to put us into the shoes of the people who were going through this horrific experience. Tardi's examination of World War I in this book almost surpasses his previous It Was the War of the Trenches, with at least the kind of research and the kind of citation and the narratives that he's able to draw out of those. An illustrated chronology by Jean-Pierre Verny at the end of this book takes us through exactly that research year by year and shows us in photographic detail the horrors that we have just seen in this book. Like it was a war of the trenches, Godamn This War is an absolute masterpiece. Tardi summons everything he has at his disposal to tell this story. With the publication of Godamn This War, Fantagraphics put It Was the War of the Trenches and Godamn This War into a collector's box set. Although I don't think it's a limited edition, I believe they reprinted it soon, and this just is a handsome way to have both of these fantastic, masterful works. After Godamn This War and the box set in 2013, it would be 2 years before the next Tardi book from Fantagraphics. In 2015, Fantagraphics published Run Like Crazy, Run Like Hell, originally published in 2011. So another close publication to the original French, only 4 years apart. Run Like Crazy, Run Like Hell is the third Manchette adaptation of Tardi's to be published by Fantagraphics, and this might be my favorite one. It is another bleak, hyper-violent noir with some very interesting people to root for. It tells the story of a woman who has been recently released from an asylum. She'd been institutionalized and is hired to serve as a nanny for a rich person's kid. The kid is kidnapped, and they kidnap her as well because they're going to pin the blame on her, but she is a lot more resourceful, a lot tougher, and a lot more violent than anyone, including the reader, had expected. This is a crackerjack chase story with this woman and this kid and the people chasing them. In some ways, absolutely pure pulp noir storytelling done pitch perfectly, all the way to by now you should expect it bleak climax. Run Like Crazy, Run Like Hell, like West Coast Blues and Like a Sniper Lining Up His Shot, is a terrific comic if you like your humor black and have the stomach for some violence. Fog Over Tolbiac Bridge, the first Nesta Burma mystery, was published by Fantagraphics in 2017. The original had been published in 1982. As a novel by Leo Mallet, Fog Over Tolbiac Bridge was actually a prequel. He wrote the novel years after he had created the detective Nesta Burma, but Jacques Tardi started adapting Leo Mallet's works with this book. So it's a prequel in the novels, but a first adventure in the comics. I was waiting for Fantagraphics to start publishing Nesta Burma stories. Fog Over Tolbiac Bridge had in the 80s been serialized by Fantagraphics in one of their magazines, of which I had hunted down every issue in order to read this story. But now it finally joined their hardcover library with another wonderful detective story that gave an identity to a Paris neighborhood just the way The Bloody Streets of Paris had done. You also got a little bit about Nesta Burma's history and his past, and all in all, this is a terrific and entertaining read. Not as dark and as violent as Tardi's Manchette adaptations, but still grimy, dirty, full of urban landscapes and firmly rooted in place. The next 3 years, 2018, 2019, and 2020, saw one volume each published of Jacques Tardi's magnum opus, I, Rene Tardi, Prisoner of War in Stalag 2B. These 3 books make up a biographical and autobiographical account of Jacques Tardi's father, who in the Second World War was taken prisoner by the Germans and ended up as a prisoner for the rest of the war. Volume 1 deals with him in Stalag 2B. Volume 2 is about the German soldiers evacuating the POW camp as the Russians close in on them, and Volume 3 about life after the war, including a childhood autobiographical portrait of young Jacques Tardi. These books take Tardi's accomplishment with his World War I stories to almost another level. This is not just a work of archaeology and a work of putting his father's stories on paper, but it's also a way of examining his relationship with his father, not in the way that Art Spiegelman did in Maus, but about how an entire generation of people ended up as a result of their wartime experiences, how it affected them and their families from then on. The survival part of the story is as harrowing as you would think it would be, and once again we have those 3 long panels, a format that Tardi sticks to for every page of this work. These 3 books are as merciless and as full of detail as his noir work, but just like his previous World War I stories, there's an unmistakable anti-war rhetoric in these stories that comes through by focusing on personal experiences and individual lives and the damage that war does to them. These are fantastic books in every way, and I was also very happy to see in 2018-19, 20 that Fantagraphics had decided to bring these out in these larger formats compared to the formats of all their other Tardi books so far. This is the European album size, albeit in hardcover, and is a treatment this work richly deserves. It also includes the short stories Fatale and Nada, as well as unfinished stories. Tardi was obviously a big fan of Manchette, having adapted many of his works, and this volume gives the European-sized hardcover treatment to these stories. There's also volume 2 of Streets of Paris, Streets of Murder, which collects together the 2 novel adaptations, Like a Sniper Lining Up His Shot and Run Like Crazy, Run Like Hell. So basically you get West Coast Blues, Like a Sniper Lining Up His Shot and Run Like Crazy, Run Like Hell, all collected together, plus a couple more stories in these larger format hardcover volumes. And as if that wasn't enough, these 2 volumes are also collected together in this very handsomely designed slipcase. So this is the way that Fantagraphics has chosen to publish these books, but let me quickly tell you how it would be if you were reading them chronologically from the 70s. The very first full-length Tardi work in French, I think, is coming out later this year, 2021, from Fantagraphics. Farewell, Brindavoine, originally published by Casterman in 1974. Next would be the Arctic Marauder from 1974. Then the First Adventures of Adele Blanc Sec from 1976, followed by the second volume of adventures, which were published in 1977 and 1978. You Are There was published in 1979. York Mon Amour collects stories from a variety of times in the 80s. It Was the War of the Trenches from 1993. West Coast Blues from 2005. Godamn This War from 2008. Like a Sniper Lining Up His Shot from 2010, Run Like Crazy, Run Like Hell from 2011, I, Rene Tardi Part 1 from 2012, I, Rene Tardi Part 2, My Return Home from 2014, and I, Rene Tardi Part 3, After the War from 2018. Of course, this chronological order is just the way it stands right now. As Fantagraphics continues to publish more volumes of Tardi, they'll be filling in gaps that exist right now, and I'm really looking forward to them continuing to bring us the works of this master. A quick look online shows me that there are still, luckily, lovelily, a lot of Tardi books remaining to be translated. He is very prolific. He continues to work, I think, even up to today. So there are 4 other Nestor Burma adventures that he adapted that remain to be translated, including the new edition, which I know is coming, of The Bloody Streets of Paris. There are 4 or 5 other Adele Blanc Sec adventures that remain to be translated. So I'm looking forward to continuing my annual tradition of reading a new Tardi book or 2 for some time to come. I hope you enjoyed this quick look at the Fantagraphics collection of Tardi comics thus far. This has been For the Love of Comics. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.